So obviously, one of the biggest concerns right now regarding premium financing are increasing borrowing rates. So what I'm going to do is go through some recent historical data regarding CMT rates as well as SOFR rates. So what we're looking at on the screen right here, these are historical 1 month CMT rates starting at the beginning of this year, January 2nd, 2003. The 1 month CMT rate was 4.17%. Then we saw it steadily increase and we saw it peak on March 9th at 4.83%. And then we see it actually plummet quite a bit. This was on March 21st, 2003, down to 4.07%. Then it spiked up again, and then it tanked again. This was actually just yesterday, April 17th, 2023, plummeted back down to 4.09%. So we've seen quite a bit of volatility here, but it does look like the 1 month CMT rates are starting to settle down again. Now, one of our lenders uses the 1 month CMT rate plus a spread of 2.75%. So as of yesterday, the borrowing rate would have been 6.84%. And that is for annual premiums between $1 million and $1.49 million. This is just one of several different lenders we use. I'm just using this as one example. If we go over to historical SOFR rates, this is the 1 year SOFR, and we started out at 4.31% on January 3rd, 2023. Then we saw it pop up to, just north of 4.5%, and it kind of stayed there between the end of January all the way up into mid March, right around 4.55%. And then we saw it pop up to right around 4.8% just a few days later, and then kind of hover around 4.8% all the way up until April 18th, 2023. One of our lenders uses the 1 year SOFR plus a 1.40% spread, which would have put them at 6.20% as of yesterday. And again, that is for annual premiums north of $1 million. So what I thought I would do is kind of show you the historical relationship between borrowing rates and crediting rates, because what most folks do in premium financing is they're solely focused on the borrowing rates in isolation. For the last several years, I have not been selling premium financing based on low borrowing rates. I've been selling premium financing based on understanding the symbiotic relationship between borrowing rates and crediting rates. So another big concern people have right now is the fact that it appears that we are going to continue to be going deeper into a recession. Whether that's true or not, if that is people's perspective, that is one fear they're going to have regarding premium financing. So in my software, I actually developed a new 40-year synthetic construct here. If you look at the top red box there, we start off with the year 2000. We run that through 2021. Very soon I'll have to update that to 2022. But the reason we start with the sequence is that the first 10 years of this sequence are awful and are, quite frankly, the worst decade within recent modern history. After this 22-year run here, then we are running at a static return. Typically, we'll run it at AG49A max. For this particular design here, I ran it at 5.40%, just to be conservative, which is less than the AG49 max for this particular product. If I blow up the first 10 years of the sequence here, again, we've got 2000 through 2009, which was a terrible way to start out. And we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 negative S&P returns, and they're in column 12, which would mean if this were an actual real world IUL, the index credit would have been 0. 5 out of the first 10 years of the sequence, and even more specifically, 3 zeros back to back to back in the first 3 years of the sequence here, which is pretty awful. But what I also did was I took a look at historical borrowing rates during this exact same period of time here with one of our lenders, and it looks like this. So the current borrowing rate as of April 2023 is actually lower than 7.82%, which would have been in the year 2000. So we have a terrible recession that we're modeling here for the first 10 years. And we have borrowing rates actually higher than they are currently. But the reason this is so important to show is that this is the concern that folks have. What happens if borrowing rates continue to increase, and what happens if we simultaneously go into a pretty deep recession here? What I'm showing people is that historically speaking, there has been a 2 year lag period between a market correction and an interest rate adjustment. So, what I mean by that is if you look at the first year in the sequence, the year 2000, that was the first year of the dot com bubble bursting. If we look 2 years later, we see the borrowing rate drop from high 7% to low 4%. And then it decreases down to 3.67%, decreases again down to 3.35%. And then if we look at 2003, when we come out of the dot com bubble bursting, the S&P 500 produced a 32.19% return. If this was an IUL, they would have hit the cap, assuming the cap is 10% in this hypothetical scenario here. 2 years later, the borrowing rates start to increase again, right? From 3.35% to 4.55, up to 6.62, up to 7.44. And then we see it start to come down again. And the big drop is when we go into the mortgage crisis in 2007. Again, 2 years later, that borrowing rate would have dropped from 5.24% to 2.55%. So it would have essentially got cut in half. Now, this is the story or the narrative that really needs to be told regarding premium financing, especially right now, because you have to get the client to understand that you don't premium finance because the borrowing rates are low, and you don't not premium finance because borrowing rates are high. What you have to look at is, again, the historical relationship between borrowing rates and crediting rates. And you also have to understand the cycle that the borrowing rates go through, again, in this scenario, 2 years after a market correction, whether that market correction be a negative one or a positive one. Okay, so let's take a look at what the forward curve rates look like. The forward curve rates are based on what the so-called smart money folks believe are going to happen to borrowing rates in the future. They usually project this out 14 years out from current. The forward curve rates are published quarterly. This one just came out at the end of first quarter, March 31st, 2023. And what this graph shows here is the current borrowing rate with one of our lenders as of April 18th. The all-in borrowing rate would have been 6.20%. That is the base rate plus the lender's spread. And using this scenario here, this is SOFR plus 140. The forward curve rates based on this type of loan construction are projecting that next year the borrowing rate would tank down to 4.49%. And then they're projecting a very slow yet steady increase to where over the next 14 years or so, that borrowing rate will get just north of 5%. If you want to learn more about the forward curve rates, you can certainly look that up on the internet. There's tons of information that explain what the forward curve rates are based on. So at least it gives you kind of a different perspective on what might happen in the future. What's interesting about this forward curve rate graph here is that it is right in line with what I just talked about regarding the 2 year lag. So last year in 2022, the S&P produced a negative return of negative 22%. So if we look at that 2 year lag period that we just discussed, it would make sense that 2 years later in 2024, because of that crash, that the borrowing rates should decrease, again, based on that 2 year lag theory that we just looked at regarding historical borrowing rates and crediting rates. So that narrative fits right in line with what these forward curve rate projections are depicting on this graph right here. So I think what's extremely valuable about our backtesting software is that we can model all of that type of volatility and the historical data that we just talked about. On this particular graph here, this black line is the as illustrated death benefit net of loans, assuming a 5.4% static return inside the policy. And these numbers were taken right out of the carrier illustration, assuming that 5.40% return. The blue line here, those values are taken right out of the carrier illustration and are a depiction of the ongoing net cash surrender value, again, as depicted in the carrier illustration. The dotted green line there represents the synthetic account value in our proxy, in our backtesting software, during the 40-year period that produced the worst compounded annual growth rate out of 121 different historical 40-year periods that we analyze. And then up top there, the heavily dashed green line shows a simulated account value during the best 40-year period in our backtesting software. But what's really interesting, and quite frankly, what I find arguably the most interesting, is the solid green line here. Those are the simulated account values in our backtesting proxy, assuming the first 22 years are between the years 2000 and 2021, which again started out with the worst decade in modern history, right? The years 2000 through 2009. Again, there would have been 5 zeros in the first 10 years in terms of index credits. And then after those 22 years, then we level it off and we use 5.4% returns simply because that's what we ran in the carrier illustration. Now, over this 40-year period, the synthetic cash value in the proxy is significantly more than the blue line, which is the as illustrated cash value, roughly 50% more over that 40-year period, which should give the client a lot of confidence regarding how the premium financing arrangement has been structured and being able to withstand a terrible recession going into the first 10 years of that 40-year sequence. Again, during that time, we're using historical borrowing rates that match up with the historical simulated index credits. So it's really more of a fair historical depiction. The other green lines, the dotted green line and the dashed green line, assume a steadily increasing borrowing rate. Despite the fact that the forward curve rates do not indicate that that's going to happen, we still run the dotted green line and the dashed green line. Again, that's the worst 40-year period and the best 40-year period, assuming a steadily increasing borrowing rate. Again, just to be conservative. If we go back to the forward curve graph here, this is all crystal ball stuff to a certain degree. Nobody knows what the market is going to return. Nobody knows what the index are going to credit. No one knows what the caps are going to be, and no one knows what the borrowing rates are going to be in the future. Let's not make decisions based on what we think market performance is going to do this year or what we think the borrowing rate is going to be over the next 1 to 6 months, but instead look at history and look at the symbiotic relationship between the borrowing rates and crediting rates. Historically speaking, there's been a nice, healthy, positive arbitrage between borrowing rates and crediting rates regarding premium financing. And we've got more data that you can shake a stick at to show what those historical numbers look like. But hopefully this overview of what I see happening in premium financing right now is helpful. And as always, you can always contact me directly if you have any questions. Have a great day. Darren Sugiyama signing off.